When investigators arrived at Lake Mattoon in late June 2026, they were confronted with a difficult question before they could ask any others. Who was the victim? Without an identity, every homicide investigation begins at a disadvantage. Detectives cannot establish a reliable timeline, identify recent contacts, or determine where to focus their resources. Before they can investigate what happened, they must first determine who the victim was. In this case, investigators found an early lead in a distinctive identifying feature. According to authorities, human remains recovered from the lake included an arm bearing recognizable tattoos. Detectives documented those markings and compared them with available records. That process helped investigators identify the victim as 38-year-old Dale Wayne Turner. With an identity established, the investigation changed direction. Instead of searching for an unknown victim, detectives could now reconstruct Turner's final known movements. Investigators interviewed people who knew him, reviewed available records, and began assembling a timeline of his last known contacts. Like many homicide investigations, the case advanced through a series of small developments rather than one dramatic breakthrough. Each verified fact was compared with the next, allowing investigators to narrow their focus and determine where additional evidence might be found. That process eventually led detectives to seek legal authorization to search a residence connected to the investigation. Search warrants are not issued simply because investigators have suspicions. They require probable cause supported by information presented to a judge. Once authorized, investigators documented the scene, collected potential evidence, and followed established forensic procedures designed to preserve the integrity of every item recovered. As the investigation continued, authorities announced criminal charges against 2 individuals. Court records indicate that one defendant later stated the fatal encounter occurred in self-defense. That claim, like every other allegation in the case, will ultimately be evaluated through the judicial process, where prosecutors and defense attorneys will each have the opportunity to present evidence and challenge the other's interpretation. One aspect of the investigation continues to stand out. The case illustrates how victim identification often shapes everything that follows. Whether investigators rely on fingerprints, DNA, dental records, or distinctive physical characteristics such as tattoos, establishing identity is frequently the first major step toward understanding what happened. In this investigation, authorities say that recognizing those tattoos allowed detectives to move from an unidentified recovery to a focused criminal investigation. As the case proceeds through the courts, the evidence collected by investigators and the legal arguments presented by both sides will determine how the facts are ultimately assessed. Until that process is complete, the defendants remain presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in court. Beyond the individual case, the investigation serves as a reminder of how modern homicide inquiries are built, not on assumptions or isolated discoveries, but on careful documentation, forensic examination, corroborated evidence, and judicial oversight. Sometimes a single clue opens the door, but it is the disciplined investigative process that determines where that door ultimately leads. As investigators continued their work, the next challenge was no longer identifying the victim. It was determining whether the available evidence formed a consistent and reliable timeline. Every homicide investigation depends on chronology. Detectives seek to answer a series of fundamental questions. When was the victim last seen? Who had contact with the victim during that period? What physical or digital evidence can confirm those interactions? And do witness statements align with the objective evidence? To answer those questions, investigators typically compare multiple independent sources of information. Interviews may be checked against phone records, surveillance footage where available, financial activity, and forensic findings. No single piece of evidence is expected to tell the entire story. Instead, investigators look for points where independent evidence supports the same conclusion. According to publicly reported court records, investigators in this case gathered evidence from both the recovery scene and a residence connected to the investigation. Each location required its own forensic examination, documentation, and evidence preservation procedures. Crime scene specialists are trained to document a scene before anything is moved. photographs, measurements, and written observations create a permanent record that allows investigators, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and ultimately a jury to understand how evidence was discovered. Maintaining that record is an essential part of ensuring the integrity of the investigation. The investigation also highlights an important distinction that is sometimes misunderstood by the public. An arrest is not the same as a conviction. Investigators may believe they have gathered sufficient evidence to support criminal charges, but those allegations must still be tested in court. Prosecutors bear the burden of proving the charges beyond a reasonable doubt, while the defense has the right to challenge the evidence, question witnesses, and present alternative explanations. In this case, court records indicate that one defendant has asserted that the fatal encounter occurred in self-defense. Whether that claim is supported by the evidence is a question that will ultimately be resolved through the judicial process rather than by public opinion. For investigators, however, the objective remains the same regardless of competing legal arguments. Their responsibility is to collect, preserve, and present evidence as accurately and objectively as possible. Every documented observation, every forensic examination, and every witness interview becomes part of a larger factual record that allows the court to evaluate what happened. The investigation that began with the recovery of unidentified human remains had now evolved into something much broader, a detailed examination of evidence, timelines, and competing accounts, each of which would play a role as the case moved through the justice system. As the case continues through the criminal justice system, another phase begins, one that is often less visible to the public, but equally important. Preparing a homicide case for trial is a lengthy process. Prosecutors must organize thousands of pages of reports, photographs, laboratory results, and interview summaries. Every piece of evidence that may be presented in court must be disclosed to the defense, allowing both sides to examine the same factual record before trial. This process reflects one of the fundamental principles of the American justice system. A criminal conviction must be based on evidence that can withstand scrutiny in court. Defense attorneys in turn carefully review the investigative record. They may question whether evidence was collected according to proper procedures, whether witness statements are reliable, or whether forensic findings support the conclusions presented by the prosecution. In some cases, independent experts are asked to evaluate the same evidence from a different perspective. For jurors, these technical issues can become just as important as the facts themselves. The outcome of a criminal trial often depends not only on what evidence exists, but on how credible, reliable, and legally admissible that evidence proves to be. Judges may hear arguments about forensic procedures, investigative methods, or the interpretation of scientific findings before certain evidence is even presented to a jury. That careful review is one reason homicide prosecutions often move more slowly than the public expects. Although headlines may appear within days of an arrest, the legal process frequently continues for many months. During that time, investigators may complete additional forensic testing. Prosecutors may refine their case, and the defense may continue examining every aspect of the investigation. For the victim's family, this period can be especially difficult. While an arrest may provide some answers, it does not bring immediate closure. Families often wait through hearings, legal motions, and court proceedings before the evidence is fully examined in a public courtroom. Cases like this also demonstrate why investigators emphasize objective documentation from the very beginning. Memories can fade, public discussion can change, and opinions may differ. Physical evidence, properly preserved and carefully analyzed, provides a more stable foundation for determining the facts. In the end, every homicide investigation is measured by the same standard, not by how quickly arrests are made or how much public attention a case receives, but by whether the evidence can be presented fairly, tested thoroughly, and evaluated according to the rule of law. That principle remains at the center of every major criminal investigation, including this one. Looking beyond the individual facts of this case, investigators often point to one lesson that applies to nearly every homicide inquiry: the importance of establishing identity as early as possible. Without knowing who the victim is, detectives are forced to investigate hundreds of possibilities. Once an identity is confirmed, however, the investigation becomes far more focused. Investigators can begin reconstructing the victim's recent activities, identifying close contacts, reviewing available communications, and determining where to concentrate investigative resources. This is why forensic identification is considered one of the first major milestones in any homicide investigation. The public often associates forensic science with DNA analysis, but modern investigations rely on many different forms of identification. Fingerprints, dental records, medical records, distinctive scars, tattoos, personal property, and eventually laboratory testing all contribute to building a reliable identification. Each method has strengths and limitations. A visible identifying feature may provide investigators with an immediate lead, while laboratory testing can later confirm that identification through scientific analysis. Rather than replacing one another, these methods are designed to work together, allowing investigators to move quickly while maintaining accuracy. Another important aspect of homicide investigations is documentation. Every action taken by investigators must be recorded. Evidence is photographed before it is collected. Its location is documented. Each transfer between investigators, forensic laboratories, and court personnel is recorded through a chain of custody. These procedures help ensure that evidence presented in court can be traced from the moment it was recovered until the day it is introduced as evidence. That level of documentation serves an important purpose. It protects the integrity of the investigation, but it also protects the rights of everyone involved. Courts expect investigators to demonstrate not only what evidence was collected, but how it was handled throughout the investigation. Careful documentation allows both prosecutors and defense attorneys to examine the same factual record and challenge any issues they believe are significant. Ultimately, cases like this illustrate that criminal investigations are built on patience rather than assumptions. A single discovery may attract public attention, but investigators rarely reach conclusions based on one piece of evidence alone. Instead, they compare independent sources of information, verify timelines, test forensic findings, and continue evaluating new information as the case progresses through the courts. As future hearings take place, additional evidence and legal arguments may become part of the public record. Those proceedings, not speculation outside the courtroom, will provide the framework for determining how the evidence is ultimately assessed. For investigators, that is the central objective of every homicide case: to gather facts that can be examined openly, challenged fairly, and evaluated according to the law.